Hello again, and here's another video about SEND support. Now, last time Terry and I were talking about one-page profiles, and today we're going to move on to talk about one planning and what that means and what it looks like. First of all, maybe you could just give us an explanation about, if we already have a one-page profile, why might we need to move to one planning?
Okay, so you would expect to move to one planning if your child has been identified as having SEND, which is special educational needs and disabilities, and requires support in one or more of the 4 broad areas of need as outlined in the Code of Practice. So the 4 broad areas of need are communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health difficulties, sensory and or physical needs.
Yeah, so there are 4 broad areas of need that are recognised within the Code of Practice, but sometimes those needs can be met just with a one-page profile like we outlined in our last video, but sometimes it might be that a child needs a bit of a higher level of support there, and that's where one planning comes in. So maybe, Terry, you could just talk us through the one planning process. What does that look like?
Yeah, of course I can. So a one planning is a way to complete the graduated approach in a person-centred way. The graduated approach, one planning, should follow 4 stages, and this is often referred to as a cycle. So the 4 stages of the cycle are assess, which would be when the class or the subject teacher working with the SENCO would carry out a clear analysis of the child's needs and gather the views and evidence from parents, the child and any other professionals that are involved with the child. The next stage would be plan, so meaning the teacher and the SENCO in consultation with the parents and the child agree on the outcomes that are important to the child. Okay, the next stage is do. This means putting the plan into place and the SENCO supporting the school staff to deliver what is in the plan. And then the last stage is review. And this means looking at what difference the support and interventions is making, deciding if the support should continue, change, or come to an end. The cycle of assess, plan, do, and review then starts again.
Yes, so there's a lot to unpick in all of that. So what we're saying is that if the child has previously or currently has a one-page profile, and yet despite some of those strategies or recommendations being put into place, the child is still not making expected progress for the one reason or another. And so the one plan then outlines the specific support that's needed around those areas of difficulty. And you've described there the 4 broad areas of need. So in the assess phase there, obviously what school's going to be doing with the teacher and the SENCO and everybody else who's contributing is they're just going to be looking at what progress is the child making, where is the child struggling. They might be looking at comparisons with national data about how children at that age and stage should be progressing, and then thinking about devising this plan. And that's the point at which the school must inform the parents of that there's a plan being put into place. So that's what it says in the Code of Practice. And so we've got these stages that you've just described there. So there's an assessment of the needs of the child. A plan is drawn up, and the idea is that one planning should be done as a collaborative process between the school and the parents and the young person. This is good practice. So I often hear examples where parents will say they don't know what their child one plan looks like, or the school has given them a one plan, but they hadn't have a conversation about it. But that's not the way it should happen. It should be being something that's done together. So when the school is devising a plan, there's a duty on them to inform you about that. And then the implementation is the part of the do part is when it's implemented, and that work is carried out with the child. Those supports are put in place and then reviewed. So let's just have a little think then, Terry. So we've got those rather complicated cycles, but it does make sense once you get into the process. But out of that one planning process of assess, plan, do, review, we're going to think now about the plan part. So this is what's often called a one plan. So what does a one plan look like?
So a one plan will have the long-term outcome. Then next to that, it will have a short-term next steps. Those short-term next steps should be SMART steps. So they should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and have a time frame. Then you have where the child is, their current level, where they currently are. Then you would have what interventions and strategies are going to be put into place, and then how often and by whom. And then lastly, you would have a review section, and that would be where you would say what has worked, what didn't work, and what needs changing.
Yes, Terry. So the one plan that you've described there, with those particular columns, you're right that what we need is these very specific targets. And I think that of the work that I do with families, this is probably the single issue that comes up the most often, is that I often see one plans that are not specific enough, or where the targets for support are not related necessarily to the child's areas of need. So you've identified those 4 broad areas of need. So for example, some of the targets that I see from families are written by schools because they're targets that they would like the child to make their life easier in a way. So sometimes they might say something like to remain seated during the lesson. So that might be because the child is bobbing up and down the whole time. So they put the target in there to remain seated during the lesson. Well, obviously that's an outcome that probably is desirable, to have the child seated throughout the lesson. But actually maybe what the issue is that child is struggling with their sensory regulation. And so actually what they need is adequate sensory supports so that they can remain well regulated throughout the day. So the target then needs to be written in a slightly different way with a different kind of focus. So this issue about sensory regulation is one that comes up for pretty much every family that I work with, I would say, who have children with additional needs. So for me there, the long-term outcome would be to remain well regulated throughout the day. Then we might break that down into a short-term target that says for the child to access regular body breaks and whole body movement with resistance several times a day. Or it might say something like to engage with the zones of regulation, for example, this package of support and teaching around emotional regulation. So maybe to have the child using the zones of regulation with support 4 times a week. So those are specific ways in which we might address the long-term needs of the child to remain well regulated. So then, as you said, what we might say is, what's the current level of the child? Well, that might be where we say, well, during lesson times, they're bobbing up and down and they can't sit still for longer than 2 minutes. And then you'd go on to outline the intervention and strategies, and then how often will that be implemented and who will do it. So that might say zones of regulation 4 times a week, 20 minutes each session, alongside with 2 other peers and the learning support assistant there. And then at the very end, there'll be this column about reviewing it to see how that's gone for that term. And the other thing that I would say is, what I often see with these one plans that parents come to me to ask for help with is that those targets are not specific. They're written too broadly. So that means that the children are not achieving those targets, and so they get rolled over. So what happens is we seem to have one plan after one plan, and they don't really seem to change that much. It just says, oh, this target is ongoing. Well, that shouldn't be the case. The target should be reset at the review cycle each time, where we then reassess the ability and the needs of the child, and then remake the plan and then implement it and go through these assess, plan, do, review cycles again. So I know that the local authority have template one plans on the local offer, and I'll put the link to that with this video. But I personally have a different format that I prefer to use, and that's the format I use with most parents. So you'll be able to see that here. All right, Terry, so we've covered the assess, plan and do part. So let's just think about reviewing it then. How should these one planning meetings take place?
So the SEND code of practice is not specific about the frequency of reviews, but given that the code suggests that schools should meet with parents 3 times a year, good practice would indicate that reviews should be at least termly. The decision to involve specialists can be taken at any time and should always involve the parents. I think it's really important as well to mention here that any reviews that are taking place, the child should be at the centre of those reviews, and the parents should also be a part of that process.
Yeah, so that's right, that good practice is that those review meetings should happen termly, but there's nothing in the code of practice that says they can't happen more often than that. So if you've got a particular pressing need, or your child has a high level of need that requires some very quick interventions, and you want to change something that you've got a very time specific period there, then you could actually have those review meetings more frequently if everybody agreed that that's what was in the best interest of the child. But it's true to say that those meetings should happen as a conversation together. So there should be a conversation together with the school and the family, including the young person where that's appropriate, to just review how things have been going, and together to reset where those targets need to be. And everybody should have the opportunity to present their evidence about what has happened within that review period. So hopefully that's useful information. So Terry, given that we've got this cycle of assess, plan, do, review going on, you're having the regular review meetings, those one plans are being produced together in partnership, where would we be, do you think, if the child is still failing to make adequate progress? What would the next step be here?
The next step then would be looking at an application for an education, health and care needs assessment, which can be applied for either by the school or by yourself as a parent.
Okay, so I feel like that's the topic that we'll cover in our next video, Terry, because we've covered a lot here today around one planning, haven't we? So if that's okay, we'll come back together next time, shall we, and speak about education, health and care plan and the needs assessment process.